Hello viewers, Sam Stafford here, reporting from home in Ripponden in West Yorkshire. As you may know, if you have listened to episode number 136 of my podcast, there was something of a gap between it and episode number 135, and to help catch up with everything in between, which was a lot, I invited some friends of the podcast, old and new, to discuss some of the policy areas of most interest to them, and hopefully to you viewers. 9 conversations were recorded, elements of which form part of episode number 136, but I am publishing them all in full here on the YouTube channel. This is the third of the 9, and is a conversation between Claire Petricca-Riding, Gilian MacInnes, Sarah McLaughlin and Robbie Owen about infrastructure planning. Claire is Head of Planning and Environment at Irwin Mitchell. Gillian has her own consultancy advising local authorities on infrastructure planning and delivery and planning service management. Sarah is Head of Growth and Infrastructure at Hertfordshire County Council, and Robbie is Head of Infrastructure Planning and Government Affairs at Pinsent Masons. Their conversation takes in what is and is not in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill, including reference to the Banner Review, the overlap between infrastructure planning and the return of strategic planning, and the funding landscape. Enjoy.
We've had the working paper that was announced in January, and obviously we've had then the proposals in the Planning and Infrastructure Bill. Robbie, how do you feel about all of this?
Well, I think the bill's a good start, and I really mean that. I think government's done incredibly well to get it into Parliament really quite so soon. But there is much more to be done in 2 respects, I'd say. First of all, about half of the proposals in the infrastructure planning working paper published in January have not found their way through into the bill yet, and that needs to happen. And secondly, I think there are additional measures that the government needs to consider for adding to this bill, or in fairly short order another bill, to really make a bigger difference than this bill will make.
What roughly will they? What does that look like? Do you think, or do you think we're going to have more information when the infrastructure strategy is announced later on in the year?
Well, I think the National Infrastructure Strategy is due to be announced in June at the same time as the outcome of the spending review. That will set out what government wants to do in terms of public investment in nationally significant infrastructure projects and how they're going to be paid for. I think in relation to the planning element of big infrastructure projects, which is what the Planning and Infrastructure Bill is largely there to do, I don't see that as being particularly reliant on the 10-year National Infrastructure Strategy. I think there are some more immediate issues that we're all aware of, but which the bill does not yet tackle fully in relation to some quite technical areas, but which are important, but also some bigger areas like what do we do about judicial review of decisions relating to infrastructure projects.
But beautifully introduced there, Robbie. So how do you feel about what are now being colloquially termed as the Banner of reforms in terms of judicial review for the DCA regime?
I think we are being slightly gaslighted about the Banner reforms, or rather the reforms the government is taking forward in the light of the Banner review, because they are really very modest, and yet the impression being given by ministers and government press releases is that they are really quite significant. I don't accept that for one moment. I don't think they will make much of a difference in terms of changing the way in which those wanting to proceed with a judicial review of a decision in relation to infrastructure schemes have to get permission of the court before they can bring their claim. That is the focus of the changes in the bill in terms of what is the procedure for seeking the court's permission to bring a judicial review. But if permission is then granted, although they are reducing the number of bites at the cherry that claimants can have in terms of seeking permission, once permission is granted, then the normal procedure will carry on applying. Government is going to be pressing the Court of Appeal and the Supreme Court to introduce target timescales for dealing with appeals, but fundamentally nothing is going to change in terms of how judicial reviews, once they've been given permission to be brought, are then heard. And as we've seen from some recent cases, we have had some significant delays with judicial reviews of infrastructure projects. In the case of the now cancelled Stonehenge Tunnel scheme, that project was delayed by over 4 years by two series of judicial reviews, and in the middle of that, by redetermination of the development consent order that was being reviewed. So there is still, I think, with the next generation of controversial projects coming towards us, the real potential for those projects to be equally delayed, even though the changes the bill is making to the permission stage are even with those in place.
Okay, great. Thank you for that. Will the proposals, Gillian and Sarah, in terms of local government reorganisation and the reintroduction of strategic plan, do we think that might help this process along?
I definitely do. I mean, Sarah's maybe closer to her than I am, but I think that the strategic approach and the strategic development strategies and the change in geographies will make a big difference in terms of delivery of growth supported by infrastructure, in terms of everything from the evidence that goes forward into local plans, as well as the development strategies, but also in terms of making sure that it can be justified, and funding. And I think so much of it, the changes in geography will hopefully, I mean, it's not going to magic up money as such, but I think in terms of the responsibilities, I mean, one of the aspects of the requirement to take a positive approach to infrastructure and from statutory consultees will, I think, make a difference, because I don't think there's the imperative at the moment. It's easy to raise objections when it comes to when it comes to making comments on plans and on large development infrastructure proposals. So this would then, hopefully that aspect of it would make a difference in terms of the positivity. But, Sarah might have a slightly different take on it, because I have been heard to say, that counties have no requirement to be positive about, for example, housing growth, because it's not part of their requirement at the moment. But I believe she may have a different take.
Thanks, Gillian. Yeah, I think it's quite right that county council authorities are positive about growth, because we have such a vested interest in the delivery of some big bits of kit in terms of infrastructure. And I think the move to SDSs, the local government reform, working on larger geographies does help us in terms of being able to plan more strategically and get the buy-in across a larger geography. I think one of the absolute pluses for me is the ability to strategically plan for infrastructure across a number of different disciplines and understand what those priorities are going to be, because as Gillian said, this isn't going to magic up money into the system, but actually there needs to be a serious conversation about what prioritization of infrastructure looks like, and I think you can achieve that better under a larger geographies with that strategic planning framework in place, which sort of sets the tone for the growth.
I also think it'll be interesting to see how the change in geography feeds into as a consultee in terms of NSIPs, and the infrastructure that ends up being planned at that very high level, and how that will facilitate delivery of growth on the ground when it comes to local authorities and the delivery of the development plan, as it will be.
Yeah, so that's quite an interesting point then. So in terms of the reorganisation of local authorities, then if we if we have, in theory, fewer local authorities or fewer statutory consultees to schemes, Robbie, do you think that that's then going to assist with a more streamlined approach so we do get back to having a faster system, noting obviously that over the last 10 years the time has doubled for a scheme to get a development consent order through. So do we think that fewer statutory consultees might help?
Gosh, it's a very hard question to answer. I mean, it might help, and certainly government's looking at streamlining the whole pre-application process for applying for a development consent order, including how you go about engaging with statutory consultees and how statutory consultees engage with intended applicants for these projects. And there's no doubt that some local authorities haven't been great at that in the past, and having fewer with greater expertise and greater ability to share skills may well assist. I think the move to spatial planning generally, that all makes perfect sense, but I'm bound to say perhaps more in theory than in practice, because the kind of challenges we've seen from those wanting to judicially review major infrastructure aren't so much, I think, challenges in relation to they think it's in the wrong place. It's often seen as just being the wrong scheme or fundamentally unacceptable. And this seems to me to demonstrate that I just think we haven't got the balance right between national and local interest, or national and sub-regional local interest for these projects. And I'm not sure that moving to a systematic arrangement of strategic and spatial planning will necessarily, in my mind, achieve a better balance between national interest, national need, and local impact. That to me is at the heart of what lies behind a lot of the attempts to slow down these projects by those that just don't want them.
Yeah. So that goes into a point then that Sarah, you were making the other day when we were speaking about it, and about how then, how do we bring that sort of consultation point, but the wider communication piece about bringing infrastructure at a local level, and how that can how national infrastructure projects can resonate at a much more local level. And what would you see as the key driver behind that?
I think it's very difficult for local residents to understand the benefits of larger infrastructure projects. They're very much concentrated, quite realistically, on things that are happening in their immediate local area. So it's very difficult to understand those broader positive impacts. And I know the government has talked about a pipeline of infrastructure projects, which I think could run from the national right down to the local level. And if it was shown in a spatial way, by which local residents could understand the projects, the timelines for when they're coming forward, and the benefits that they create at the national, sub-regional or local level, would be a massive improvement, I think. I think there's a real opportunity here to do something different in terms of how we sell the benefits of growth, for want of a better way of putting it, because I think it's very difficult for people to see actually the positives that come out of housing developments that pop up without understanding all of the bits of kit that come as a result of that. Well, it might not be immediate. It might not come along at the same time as the housing, but we're not very good at communicating across those levels, I don't think.
I definitely think that communication is a massive issue. I mean, I think it's a massive issue across the board when it comes to both, housing growth and infrastructure. Large pieces of infrastructure. I mean, I know that Heathrow, the fire at Heathrow, for example, that did bring to the public's attention, the issues of stress on the electricity, network. Now, what the final result of any inquiry is in a way sort of irrelevant, because the news on the day was about that lack of capacity. And maybe there needs to be just more information out there for the public to see the importance of it. Now, individual members of the public will always come down to what's happening at the end of their garden. They will be objecting on that basis, but maybe that change in geography, Robbie, maybe I'm more positive, that change in geography might enable the politicians to feel not quite so close. I mean, I know that others would argue that it's important to be close to the public and understand what they want, but actually, on occasion, those very vocal members of the public do not represent the whole of a community. They do not represent the whole of a sub-region or the whole of the nation. So I think I'm being positive to say, if we could only communicate better, and get a message or messages out there about why the infrastructure is required, why the housing growth is required, that would assist all of us, including the politicians.
I'm sure it will, and also I think not only the national need for these projects and why they're so critically important, but also what is the local benefit of them. And I think government needs to do much more to give guidance to infrastructure developers across all of the sectors and subsectors about what a good community benefit scheme looks like. Because at the moment there's what I would think is an over-focus on electricity transmission infrastructure, and we have a clause in the planning and infrastructure bill on that very point. But what about all the other infrastructure projects we have where we're seeing considerable issues with community benefit, not just with energy infrastructure, I should say, but also other sectors. So I think that's critical as well.
Well, it would be interesting, wouldn't it? Obviously we've got that point about the electric transmission point, and about the community benefit that would be paid for people that are affected by pylons. But it would be interesting then to see how that, if it would filter through to a much wider scope of infrastructure projects, of where there is then going to be a demonstrable impact on local communities in the same way as electricity pylons. So
Yes, of course, the problem is, have we got time to wait for that? Because we're in the thick of it now, aren't we, with all these different types of development infrastructure?
so obviously then we've discussed the bill and how that looks like, and strategic level planning, but really interested to get in how we then fund for infrastructure. So obviously we've got how it's done now and how potentially it could be done, in the future. How we deliver these large infrastructure schemes, but also how we can utilize local level funding, such as through Section 106 agreement funding or through SIL payments, and how that fits into a wider mix. And I know that when we spoke, Sarah, you'd got some sort of interesting points on that.
Well, I think the local government reform enables us to think about strategic infrastructure funding, pretty much like the mayoral SIL, I suspect, in London, where mayoral authorities could develop strategic infrastructure pots under the SIL regime. I think realistically, that's what's needed in order to bring some of these big bits of kit forward. And then obviously having locally led levies or Section 106 to bring forward site-specific infrastructure. I think that's, to me, seems like a good blend of trying to maximise the ability to fund infrastructure through planning obligations. But ultimately, developments can only bear so much. So there does need to be, I think, a bit of a fundamental think about what other pots are available, because there are some significant bits of kit, particularly when you think about strategic highways projects. A selection of developments might not be able to cover the cost of that. And I think we've seen in Hertfordshire, working on the Harlow-Gilston Garden Town programme, we've managed to lever in £170 million worth of HIG funding from government to support that scheme, but it was still subject to viability testing. So there are big questions to be asked and answered about how infrastructure might be funded, and I think planning obligations are part of that solution, but they're not the full answer.
I absolutely, absolutely agree. I think they can continue to play an important role, but actually we need to go back to much more, fundamental approach and look at whether the government is going to join up their strategies. I mean, the Treasury 10-year infrastructure strategy working paper, I mean, it's identifying what's important in terms of, from the government's mission and plan for change, that enabling resilient growth is in there. And, that is about removing the barriers to growth. Well, one of the barriers to growth that I clearly identify is the difficulty of identifying funding to support the infrastructure required to support the growth in terms of housing growth particularly, but also in terms of economic growth. And if the government can't sort this out, and again, they had a recent, the Department of Transport had a recent call for ideas on this. But to me, and I mean, I know I'm biased, but the biggest idea is actually that we tie it up together, that there is a requirement in these national funding streams that it has to relate to identify growth at a sub-regional and local level, so that a planning officer can stand there and quite clearly identify to the examiner of a plan that infrastructure is deliverable because it's on, maybe a slightly more local pipeline, but that it is there. Because if it doesn't start becoming more, more sorted out in terms of a strategy and the strategic approach to funding, then we won't be getting plans coming through. We won't be able to clearly identify the infrastructure delivery plans that support them. And even the use of the developer contributions, that will need to, it will be a fantasy to say that we could use strategic SIL and SIL and Section 106 to cover it all.
Most definitely. And then obviously when we were looking at the infrastructure planning working paper anyway, they were talking about these points in particular, in terms of how if we can get all of these things right, what it means to deliver the 150 projects, but also how it's going to be at much more local level about how you then deliver the 1.5 million new housing that needs to be achieved over the next government, but also then how it then builds into that wider piece about the resilience for the local community and local economy, but also as a national level about how we can sort of be more efficient and how we can increase productivity by even just reduction of commuting time. Say, for example, if we're building houses with better infrastructure at a local level, what that might mean to be able to then deliver wider communities, better communities, more resilient communities, because there'll be jobs nearby, but also then, we're not all spending, 3 hours commuting into a workplace destination. And it says there, better connected transport networks will unlock land for development with national highways, facilitating the delivery of an additional 45,000 homes and 44,000 jobs. So that's how critical it is about talking about this one big picture piece. It's not 150 infrastructure projects, is it?
No.
As a standalone, it's everything, how we can deliver everything.
And those 150, out of those 150 standalone infrastructure projects, so many of them will also feed in to removing barriers, whether that's electricity grid barriers, whether that's, in terms of future reservoirs or, sewage works, or, however. I mean, I would say sometimes maybe, it should be an absolute key to managing the delivery of housing. And some of that will also be addressing the issues of other things that are connected, like nutrient neutrality, which we won't be getting into because another session has done it. But, all of these things are all feeding in to our ability to deliver and remove the blockages that currently exist.
Yeah, most definitely. Most definitely, because then the next one is about the increased risk of drought, water supply and water scarcity, which then will have a knock-on effect of the homes that can be delivered in certain areas. So obviously that infrastructure piece is so important, and I'm sure that that's something that you have also come across and faced, Sarah, from a county level when we are talking about that sort of wider infrastructure piece where county tends to be the leader on that.
And it does all flow down. I mean, as Gillian's outlined, really, it does flow down from that national level right down to the local level in terms of all of when you think of all the supply chains associated with projects at the national level, they impact right down to that local level as well. There's a lot of vested interest for all of us to work together to make sure that there is a complete picture for infrastructure and how that's going to support growth coming forward in the right areas, in the right way, within the right timeframes. It's all very intrinsically linked with each other. So I think there's a real opportunity here to sort of show the connections between these projects and the benefits they provide right through that thread, from the national to the lower level.
But we've spoke about blockages, though, earlier on in this call. How can we unlock? So we've talked about funding and we've talked about the positive aspects, but there obviously is the blockages around capability and capacity at a statutory consultee level, at strategic planning level. So how do we massage that system a little bit more to be able to unblock those blockages?
Local government reform does provide the opportunity to have a broader set of skills available at the local level for local authorities with larger geographies. They have a bigger pool of teams to draw on and to share resources from within. I think as a planning profession, it's been recognised for many, many years now that capacity and capability is a problem. The 300 planners that government committed to last year is a great start. But when you spread that over the national picture, you've got to wonder how much of an impact that might make, actually. I think, again, the government are trying to bring forward new ideas, different ways of working through various channels. But there's a capacity issue, not just for planners, but for all stakeholders that are involved in the process, whether that's your local ecologist or archaeologist or the legal teams that are preparing Section 106 agreements. It affects a number of different disciplines. So the larger geographies and ability to prioritise and reduce silo working can only be a benefit, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I do think that is another of the benefits of, working at, local government reorganisation level, particularly, but also in terms of the strategic level, in that it will facilitate the ability to use the skills that exist to then bring new people and, sort of develop more skills. Another aspect, of the changes and the changes that are also in the bill are the increase in planning application fees. Now that's very specifically for applications, but that funding would also potentially enable authorities to have those specific skills and try and increase the capacity utilising that funding, because the money needs to come from somewhere, and I think that is a potentially very significant boost. But it does also mean that where the new fee money is coming into the picture, that the organisations do not then remove the central funding, because then you just end up, with a sort of zero sum. But if we can keep the funding from these larger authorities coming from the centre to fund the planning, and I say planning services, but actually the broader, the highways, everywhere I go is short of highways, expertise. Everywhere I go is short of planning solicitors. Well, not, I mean, I say everywhere, but when there is authorities that have that expertise, they're jealously guarding them from everybody else. But I think it is that ability to start a greater critical mass. And then we all need to appreciate how important it is to develop those specialities and capacity, and make sure it is funded and paid correctly. Because if we're not paying, we'll train them up and then they'll go to the private sector. So there needs to be a fundamental review of how local authorities pay specialist staff, including planners.
Hello viewers, Sam again. My thanks to Claire, Gillian, Sarah and Robbie for letting me share that conversation with you. Look out for the other 8, which I will share on here in due course. They will feature conversations about devolution, strategic planning and local government reorganisation, CPO, land value capture and benchmark land value, modernising planning committees, development and nature restoration, grey belt, statutory consultees, design and placemaking, and the flood risk sequential test. Please do keep in mind, viewers, that 50 Shades of Planning is by planners and for planners, and so if you would like to use this channel for sharing anything you think that we need to be talking about, then do please feel free to get in touch with me via samstafford@hotmail.com. What have we learnt? Well, town and country planning is very much not a black and white endeavour. There are at least 50 shades in between. Bye for now.